This film is funded by the Somali community in Kenya and Finland. Between 1991 and 2011, donor aid to Somalia amounted to $55.3 billion, according to the Center for American Progress. Since then, billions of dollars have been spent annually in Somalia. Yet the donor community and Somali authorities fail to adequately account for these public resources. Each year, Somalia is reported to be the most corrupt country in the world by Transparency International. In 2017, Somalia became even more corrupt than before. Is the level of corruption in Somalia quantifiable? Where and how were these huge amounts of Western taxpayer funds disbursed or utilized? After the collapse of the central government in 1991, corruption became a system of governance in Somalia. For nearly 3 decades, the system of corruption has relied on collusion between Western embassies, implementing organizations, and Somali collaborators. Those collaborators are often the leaders of the Somali federal and regional administrations and their associates. Somali collaborators have become pawns in the pursuit of vested Western interests. The so-called electoral process in 2016-2017 was the most corrupt in the world and in Somali history, according to the New York Times. Members of governing institutions in Somalia paid record sums of money for their positions in the executive and both houses of the legislature. The cost of buying the election was equivalent to the annual national budget in years between 2009 and 2012. The cost of running the election was a fraction of the cost of buying it. Inflation of campaign financing in this election meant many executive positions and parliamentary seats cost millions of dollars each. According to the official budget, the Somali government contribution to running the election was less than the cost of many of the individual seats in parliament. In fact, the Somali government contributed no funds to the running of the election. Donors overwhelmed by the scale of electoral corruption threatened sanctions. The unconvincing bluff led to no concrete action. The resulting system of corruption is largely maintained by clan competition for resources represented by the 4.5 formula for power sharing. The system of corruption at the center has been replicated in regional member states as part of balkanization of the country. Each of these regional states has a president, a parliament, and an army. Each of these regional administrations has their own system of finance and independent relations with the donor community. These regional presidents fail to address resource sharing with their constituents. The regional presidents do not share equal responsibilities, values, or goals when it comes to monopolizing the use of force within their clan-based society. Weak and corrupt regional states have become drivers of instability. Meanwhile, the fact remains that the federal government of Somalia does not have a monopoly on the use of force within its borders. Corruption is how donors and Somali leaders interact to pursue their respective agendas in Somalia. Corruption at the Somali donor interface fuels instability and triggers migration to Western countries. Despite the trappings of formal government, the clan composition of the executive and legislature lends itself to division and exploitation by donor agencies. Positions in the legislature are distributed according to the 4.5 clan formula. Formal institutions like the legislature are paralyzed by clan power dynamics. Somali collaborators play their part in manipulating clan relations for donor interests. Corruption in Somalia rests on three pillars: Western embassies, implementing organizations, and Somali collaborators. The main diversion of Western taxpayers' funds has gone through the Somali humanitarian and security sectors. Meanwhile, nearly a decade of efforts at public financial management have resulted in higher than ever levels of corruption in Somalia. Despite the Somali financial performance, the IMF and the World Bank push for rapid debt relief for Somali officials to access even larger sums of Western taxpayers' funds. In addition, the performance of bilateral and multilateral agencies and other implementing organizations has consistently declined. The Al-Qaeda affiliated Al-Shabaab terrorist organization has been a key beneficiary for more than a decade. Despite international claims of returning to Somalia, Western representatives remain stranded at the Adan Abdullah International Airport at Halane, Mogadishu. In January 2018, the international community launched its greatest humanitarian appeal ever in Somalia, $1.6 billion for 5.4 million Somalis. Meanwhile, the Somali capital Mogadishu experienced its worst attack ever in October 2017 with over 600 civilian casualties. Both Al-Shabaab and now ISIS are on the ascendancy in Somalia. With a country run literally by 7 presidents, all with independent administrations, troops and weaponry, separately funded by Western donors, shouldn't it be possible to combat terrorism? The US has cut its assistance to the Somali security sector due to corruption. If the US did not know where its taxpayers' money was going in the Somali security sector, how can the EU and UK know where its taxpayers' money is going? This has not stopped the UK or EU outsourcing security sector activities to private entities with no impact. The enablers of corruption in Somalia form a triad in which Western embassies, implementing organizations and Somali collaborators collude at the cost of the Somali population. Western embassies have no political will to confront corruption in Somalia. Instead, they have become one of the engines of corruption. Western embassies have increasingly exploited the diversion of resources by implementing organizations to support political agendas. Implementing organizations serve as the vehicle for the diversion of resources to benefit the networks of vested interests. Bilateral enablers of Somali corruption are foreign national aid agencies. Multilateral enablers of Somali corruption are international officials. Other implementers are private and non-governmental entities. One of the practices of Western embassies is to compromise and capture Somali collaborators. Security, humanitarian, and development conditions in Somalia are worse than they have ever been. Yet, the following Western representatives have all been rewarded for their failures. Former EU head of delegation to Somalia, Mikel Sharvone Durso, has been rewarded with the EU ambassadorship to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, and Qatar. Former UK ambassador to Somalia, Neil Wigan, was rewarded with the Office of the Order of the British Empire and Director for Africa at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Former UK ambassador to Somalia, Harriet Matthews, was rewarded with a Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. Former UNSRSG in Somalia, Nicholas Kay, was rewarded with the Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George and the ambassadorship to Afghanistan. How will the current UNSRSG in Somalia, Mr. Michael Keating, be rewarded for serving UK interests at the cost of his UN duties? Meanwhile, failed Somali leaders are exiled. Former President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud is exiled between Tanzania and Turkey. Former Prime Minister Said Farah Shirdon is exiled in the UAE. Former Prime Minister Abdiweli Sheikh Ahmed is exiled between Egypt and Kenya. Former Prime Minister Omar Abdirashid Ali Sharmake is exiled between UAE and Kenya. Seeking accountability for Western taxpayers' funds in Somalia is met with extreme hostility from donor representatives and their Somali collaborators. At the 2017 London Conference on Somalia, participants agreed on a principle of mutual accountability. Within a few months, the principle of mutual accountability failed its first test. Western donors could not tolerate the Federal Parliament of Somalia questioning its aid disbursements in the country. Specifically, when the UK and the EU established a security sector payroll reform project, mutual accountability quickly gave way to cover-up. Again, the triad structure enabled collusion. In the triad structure, the SSPR project was proposed by the implementing organization Brilliant. Abrint then developed a formal project proposal. Abrint proposed to undertake actual reform of the Somali security sector payroll. Abrint requested approximately $1 million. In the triad structure, the Somali collaborator Maqan Musuq, advisor of the Ministry of Finance, played her role to convince donors to support the Abrint proposal. In particular, Maqan Musuq tried to broker donor engagement with Abrint as the implementer of the project. In the triad structure, Maqan Musuq with Abrint submitted terms of reference to UK DFID and the EU. The terms of reference detailed deliverables that included reform of the Somali security sector payroll system. In 2016, both UK DFID and the EU contracted Abrint to implement the SSPR project. UK, DFID and the EU paid Abrint upward of $1 million. Abrint delivered abstract presentations about reform but did not undertake concrete measures as outlined in the terms of reference. The gap between deliverables and payments raised the question of potential irregularities. Honorable Dr. Abdi Ali Hassan, member of Budget and Finance Committee. The Somali Parliament initiated a review of the SSPR project. The Parliament appointed Fartaag Research to undertake the review. Fartaag Consulting initiated the SSPR review in mid-2017 by addressing relevant individuals. Mr. Richard Nash, Governance Advisor, DFID Somalia. As the SSPR review proceeded, it continued to receive broad support in the Somali parliament. The Defense Committee of the Somali Parliament established a special task force of the Federal Parliament of Somalia in support of the SSPR review. Honorable Abdullahi Mohammed Noor. Those who could be affected by the findings of the SSPR review attempted to obstruct its purpose. The Parliament persevered with the review. Honorable Abdullahi Mohammed Noor, Member of Parliament, Federal Parliament of Somalia. Mr. Phil Evans, head of Defeat Somalia. The UK government refused to cooperate with the Somali parliamentary review. Meanwhile, in parallel with the parliamentary review of the SSPR project, the Ministry of Defense began to replace implicated officials. Despite the refusal of the UK government to cooperate, the Parliament continued with the SSPR review. Mr. Abadir Mohammed Ahmed, Ministry of Defense. Mr. Ivar Strand, Managing Partner, Abrent. Mr. Ian Hawley, Managing Partner, Abrent. Ms. Hodan Osman, Senior Advisor to the Ministry of Finance. letters sent during the parliamentary review process received any response.
Honorable Ali Abdi Osman, Chair of Budget and Finance Committee.
Instead of accepting accountability, donors and their Somali collaborators tried to undermine the independence of Parliament. Donors, through Somali collaborators, tried to divide the Budget, Finance, Planning and Financial Overview Committee and target MP, the Honorable Dr. Abdi Ali Hassan. The Speaker of the Parliament, Mohammed Osman Jawari, ordered the suspension of the review and the removal of MP, the Honorable Dr. Abdi Ali Hassan.
Honorable Muhammad Sheikh Osman Jawari, Speaker of the House of the People of Somalia.
In violation of the rules of procedure, the Speaker obstructed the normal activities of a parliamentary committee. So, how much do we know about Somali parliamentarians whose families live off Western social assistance and are under blackmail? How many decisions made in the parliament are influenced by the West?
Nicole Martini, Governance Advisor, DFID Somalia.
UK DFID's Governance Advisor, Nicole Martini, the successor of Richard Nash, continue to advocate for Abrint to conduct a second phase of the SSPR project. The second phase will follow the failure of the first phase. Again, the proposed budget for a second phase was over $1 million.
Honorable Abdi Rashid Abdullahi Mohammed, Defense Minister.
While the UK and EU attempted to contract Abrint for a second phase of the security sector payroll reform project, the Somali government identified the more urgent priority of verification of individuals in the security sector. Aware of the failure of the security sector payroll reform project, the Somali Minister of Defense, Rashid Abdullahi Mohammed, requested assistance from the UK for verification. The UK never responded.
Ambassador David Conker, Ambassador Veronique Lorenzo.
Instead, the UK and the EU circumvented the Minister of Defense. The UK and EU sent a threatening letter to the Somali president to overcome Somali government opposition to the security sector payroll reform project. In the days following, the UK and EU undermining of the Somali Minister of Defense, Al-Shabaab advanced on Afgoy and strengthened its presence in Mogadishu. On the 14th of October 2017, Al-Shabaab undertook its most costly attack in the capital city in terms of human lives. For his service in Somalia, UK DFID's Richard Nash received a white feather for cowardice.
With the demise of central government in 1991, the country has been faced up with progressive clan balkanization. Clan formula was institutionalized in both federal and state level, each with equal powers. Somali people find themselves immersed in a sea of unintended consequences, with particularism and unimaginable corruption. As particularism and corruption emerged, triad structure was imposed and formed by the Western donors, which eventually opened doors for the diversion of a humanitarian, security, and development aid budget. Throughout the years, Western donors have tried to spend their way out of state failure in Somalia. As of today, corruption is a political instrument of donors, Somali collaborators, and not just a diversion of public resources. Without the political will to tackle the triad structure that facilitates corruption, any and all Western policy in Somalia will continue to fail.
The Western enterprise in Somalia has become a senseless white elephant.